On to our last session of the day. We've had some really great talks over the last couple of days and some really good conversations about maternal and pediatric therapeutics. And now we'd sort of like to pivot onto planning for the future. So how do we advance maternal and pediatric therapeutics? Next slide, please. So today we're joined by 6 great panelists. We have Laura Ramsey, Tamara Lewis, Catherine Sicca, Soo-Young Choi, Kevin Watt, and Manali Desai. The format of this session is going to be a little bit different than the formats of some of our other sessions. Next slide, please. Instead of having slides, we're going to have just 3 discussion panels going over 3 topics. So first, we're going to talk about breaking down the silos. So how do we integrate maternal and pediatric therapeutics research? In our second subsession, we'll go over how do we train the next generation of maternal pediatric therapeutic investigators. So building on the great talk we had this morning for our trainees. And then finally, where do we go from here? How do we prioritize maternal and pediatric therapeutic research? Next slide. There's a few ways to interact for this discussion. You can raise your hand, you can place a comment in the chat, or you can ask a question in the Q&A box in Whova. So before we start on our first topic of breaking down silos, I'd like for our panelists to just very quickly introduce themselves. I'll call on you in the order of the slides. So Dr. Ramsey, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I am Laura Ramsey. I have a PhD in genetics, and my research focuses on pharmacogenetics. And so I only recently got pulled into all of the clinical pharmacology field, but I think it's been a great experience in learning, pharmacokinetics and how that can contribute or how the pharmacogenetics contributes to the variability in pharmacokinetics. So that's what my research has focused on. I've been at Cincinnati Children's for the last 7 years.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Dr. Lewis, could you introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Tamara Lewis. I'm a neonatologist and a pediatric clinical pharmacologist. I was at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City for the past 8 years, but recently moved up to Sick Kids in Toronto, Ontario to be the division head of pediatric clinical pharmacology here. My research interests include neonatal precision medicine, and my neonatal pharmacology research program looks at the intersection of ontogeny and genetic variability to help us understand how to use drugs better in the NICU. I'm really excited about Imprint in general and to be a part of this panel today.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Dr. Sicca, could you introduce yourself next?
Hi, I'm Kate Sticca. I'm an OB-GYN at Northwestern University in Chicago. I did a clinical pharmacology fellowship back in the mid-late 90s, where I also then worked for about 3 years as a part-time consultant for G.D. Searle. And most recently, I was the co-PI on the OPRC at Northwestern that has been studying the SSRIs in pregnancy. So I come from it from a OB-GYN perspective, a practical in the field approach.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining our panel today. Dr. Choi, could you introduce yourself next?
Sure. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Soo-Young Choi. I'm a clinical pharmacology team lead for antiviral product at FDA. So on a day-to-day basis, I look at PK and PD of various antiviral products, including HIV and COVID-19 products. And so first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this important conversation. And I'd like to congratulate everyone in this Imprint network for their achievements so far. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Dr. Watt?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. My name is Kevin Watt. I'm a pediatric intensivist and pediatric clinical pharmacologist. I was at Duke University for many years and then came out to the University of Utah 3 years ago to be division head of clinical pharmacology out here. My research focuses broadly on PK in critically ill children, and I'm also involved in a number of networks, including the Capricorn Network, which we talked about yesterday, and the Pediatric Trials Network.
Wonderful. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Desai.
Hi, everyone. Like all, I would say this is a very exciting group to be part of, and great strides made till now by IMPRED. I am a group medical leader at the Alchemy's Biopharmaceuticals in drug safety. So my role involves day-to-day looking at data and taking safety strategic decisions on how to put them on the market. So it all involves around clinical trials and clinical research and how we practically take all the preclinical, the translational medicine and put it into informed consent so that our patients can make the informed decision. The later part of my job does involve the communication piece of how do we, what we learn gets communicated back to the patients so they continue to use this information in real life. By training, I'm a gynec oncologist, having practiced for 15 years. So I do know the clinic, but more recently, I have been involved with other such initiatives, such as the Conception. Many of you may have heard of it, which is another initiative in this area, and have led 2 registries so far. So glad to be here.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists today for participating in this conversation. So our first topic to discuss today is breaking down the silos. So how do we integrate maternal and pediatric therapeutics research? And I think an important first starting off point for this conversation is to identify those silos. So what do you think are the silos between pediatric and maternal research? Any one of our panelists would like to start off?
Sure, I'll say that our hospital is a pediatric hospital, and that we don't have a whole lot of great collaborations with the other local adult hospitals. We have some, but there could definitely be better communication between our medical records systems and the researchers as well to connect the maternal and the pediatric hospitals. We have several local NICUs as well, and it's a little bit difficult to run a clinical study at any of those other NICUs that aren't related to our children's hospital. So the separation of the electronic medical records between the maternal and the pediatric and the NICUs is, I think, a definite problem that needs to be addressed before we can really get a lot of this stuff integrated together.
Yeah, Katie, I'd like to sort of add on to what Laura said, because I think that's sort of one of the key things that we need to identify. What are the pain points, or what are the things that prevent us from breaking down these silos? Because, I mean, all of us are going to be collaborative, and we would all like to work together, but there are a number of things that make that hard. In the Pediatric Trials Network, we have a study looking at drug passage into breast milk. And we've been working with the MFMU to try and collaborate for one of those drugs. And for a number of reasons, from sort of contracting and, we have 2 different DCCs, so how do they talk to one another? There are all these sort of barriers that have made it very, very difficult for us to collaborate. And so I think trying to really identify what are those pain points that prevent us from collaborating, and then try and come up with solutions to addressing those.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more to what Kevin and Laura just said. It is so much that we work in silos. And even from the clinical trials perspective, we have such few episodes that get reported, right? You generally, these are population that is excluded from taking part in clinical trials. And then one accidental event does occur, you just collect part of it, and then there is a loss of knowledge, because then we don't know what happens to that baby and what it goes. So the linkage between these medical, EMRs or whatever we call, is so much a big gap. I want to point another thing is the lack of education. Do we all, broadly are aware of these challenges and the need of this gap? Like, if you have a pregnant person, what are they going to do? They're just going to Google, can I take this medicine or not? They're going to Google. What is the source of that Google, and what are they going to? And so there's that lack of, I think, healthcare provider or whatever, our community, lack of awareness that there is this big gap and we need to generate data, and we need to generate it quickly and in a very systematic manner. So I think just that lack of knowledge or increased interest would be another area.
I'll add that I've thought about this question a bit, and I think one space that could play a really unique and important role is actually the NIH. The same office at the NIH controls sort of the funding for obstetric and perinatal and neonatal research. And, I think that oftentimes there's a research protocol focused on pregnant women that with a few tweaks could really maximize knowledge acquisition in the neonates of this population. And then sometimes there's probably perinatal research protocols submitted by, neonatologists or pediatricians that with a few changes could maximize on, sort of the late trimester information from mom and round out the information in a way that the individual research groups may not be thinking about. So when the NICHD was shuttering down the, NRN as we know it, they had a call for proposals, and I think I don't remember what I called it, but I submitted a proposal for essentially kind of like a clinical pharmacology knowledge hub within the NIH that was available / mandatory for any kind of clinical trials in pregnant women and children, so that sometimes research teams, they don't know what they don't know. And so if there was a common group of scientists available to go through their protocols with them and augment just the pharmacology aspects, but then also create that bridge between the maternal and the neonatal space, I think the NIH could play a really important role in that.
One other thing, Kevin, I think speaking to your concern about trying to get something to work with the MFMU network in terms of lactation. I work at an MFMU hospital, and it's run by MFMs, and MFMs notoriously are a referral subspecialty who take care of patients during their pregnancy, but then don't continue to take care of them, afterwards. And so during the time in which you need cooperation and investment in terms of the lactation period, they're not going to be the primary doc taking care of those patients. And so, they're just not as interested in that. And I can also speak just as a representative of the obstetrical population. I mean, I think, we are at a point in which so much historically has been focused on the fetus. When you think about OB pharmacology, the immediate reaction is, well, is it safe for the fetus? Yeah. As opposed to, does it work in the mom? Is this the right dose? Is this the right drug? What's going on in the mom? And so on the one hand, I'm jealous of the fact and envious of the fact that PEDS has gotten so much focus and so much money and has FDA support, and we don't. But the upshot of that is that the obstetrical community as a field doesn't understand pharmacology. It's not, we had literally our training has been back when you were a medical student, when you had your pharmacology course. Yes. And we use drugs without any real understanding of how they work. And so I think, this is kind of merging into a subsequent talk, but I think part of it is that, we're just not a very invested community because we really don't understand the fact that the patients we take care of are a special population. And I think, we really need to invest, real creative thinking as to how do we go about educating the OBs so that we can participate on the same level with the clinical pharmacologist, with the pediatric clinical pharmacologist, because we're just not there.
Yeah, I think these are all really wonderful points. We definitely have to identify our barriers before we can start moving past them. Now, I just want to remind everybody here at the discussion today, if you do have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, please do feel free to leave it in the chat or raise your hand or place it in the Q&A box in Whova. We've already gotten a lot of really good feedback in our chat so far based off of our conversation. And so some of the things that have been mentioned so far are in line with what you guys have already said. So what is the impact of maternal dosing on both the outcome of the mother as well as the neonate? So how are these two important patient populations impacted by dosing on the mom? And somebody brought up the interesting point. I wonder if the barriers are less in countries such as Australia, parts of Australia, where pregnant mothers are taken care of in the same system as the mother and the newborns and the infant as they age. And so do you guys have any experience with this and having reduced barriers in countries with different infrastructure such as ours? Or even communities, certain communities have, don't have as many options as others where everybody is taken care of in the same space.
I can chime in. I can relate this to India, where the obstetrician and pediatrics are generally a couple. So the wife may be an obstetrician and the husband more pediatrics. It's generally a team or a small family unit, or small hospitals that cover both, and so that continuity is possible. However, I wonder the level of knowledge again and the inert understanding that when something like this happens to report it, because unless an individual case, only an index case will not make the change, right? It is a collective data that all this real world or all these experiences put together will help us decide the next step. And so while such practices may exist and they can be learned from, we still need to do more. Yes.
The other thing I wanted to say is I think the presentation yesterday afternoon from, I think you say it GAPS, GAPPS, that was a longitudinal repository that somebody like myself deep in the neonatal pharmacology research space was not even aware of. And so, just this conference imprint sharing those type of resources, I mean, that's one of the rare biorepositories that I think it was designed to longitudinally collect obstetric data, get perinatal biosamples, and also has the ability to collect the neonatal data, both in a structured way that they're already doing. But my impression from the answer to some of the questions was that their team is willing to go back into the EHR and work with research teams to pull out other key variables that aren't currently captured. So I'd be interested if anyone in the entire group knows of any other resources like that, like GAPS, that really is a longitudinal obstetric, perinatal, neonatal biorepository that has biosamples and data across that continuum, because that was news to me and something I think really exciting.
Absolutely. And so I think that leads to our next set of questions. So what structural changes can we implement to break down these silos, break down these barriers between maternal and pediatric therapeutic research? So are there structural changes to how clinical data could be collected that would better support identification of pregnant and lactating individuals. So how do we, starting at the very beginning with how we collect our clinical data?
Well, a universal healthcare system? Dream big, right?
Or at least a universal electronic medical record.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
something like that.
Central repository. Yeah, definitely. It would benefit the clinical trial worlds also, because each company has to come up with their own way of storing this data, and then it of course goes into Sentinel. So there is you can mine the data in Sentinel, but still it's such a one-off thing. So if there was a central way of everybody collecting in the same way and putting it there, then interested researchers can go in and dive it. Definitely, from where I sit, I have this information flowing on from 3 sources. One is post-marketing individual reports. How many of us can come through it and report one incidents like this and follow it through. Second is are these registries, and third is EMR. But these EMRs, they really need to be set up in a way to collect, and I think it would be a great start. Many countries in Europe, especially Sweden, Norway, have done a great job. They collect this information in such a very systematic manner that if we were to ask a question, in a database, we would reach out to those folks. They would do a fine job to dig into their data. So there are examples out there.
Sure, and it also theoretically highlights the need for some tools that, even though we do collect our data in different manners, how can we leverage tools that are being created or that are already out there to make the data a little bit more harmonized, so that we can link them and share them and use them.
I want to echo what was told. So the actual system, some sort of universal healthcare record system would be very helpful. I'm just reflecting what I've observed for a lot of COVID-19 products and vaccines. Actually, the landmark data are very important. The first time data are coming from, actually, a lot of them are coming from Europe, especially UK, in part due to their ability to quickly collect critical information through their universal healthcare system and through data systems. So that highlights, what was discussed here, that having that type of information would be system would be very, very helpful to move forward for pediatric maternal data collection.
Yeah, and along those lines, the NCAT sponsored Trial Innovation Network is doing and continues to do work trying to identify common data elements that, this group probably be a really good group to try and put together some of those elements for, what do we want to see in studies in pregnant women and children as those elements.
Absolutely. And so another question that we have is, what data sets are out there right now that you're familiar with that could theoretically be brought together? Are there intersections of patient cohorts that could be leveraged today that we can use to study maternal and pediatric therapeutics?
NICHD- is one that I've explored a little bit, but admittedly haven't made kind of an official data request from yet. But the NICHD- website is quite user-friendly. You can search for different patient cohorts. There's a pretty good description about the research study design and methodology. And then there's also nice descriptions of the type of biosamples and variables available associated with each protocol. And so I think that NICHD- I know the NRN neonatal research network studies go into there. I don't know which, I'm pretty sure a lot of the obstetric and NIH funded studies go into there too. I think we might still find the similar barrier where they stop at birth for the mom and they begin at birth for the baby. But that's a very well curated kind of user-friendly interface that I'm aware of for maternal and neonatal research. The one thing that I worry is that I suspect drug exposures are not captured well in those data.
Yes.
So maternal drug exposures and neonatal drug exposures, and by drug I mean medicines, are probably not captured well, but there may be unique data sets in there where those variables are captured.
Yeah, but there are some vendors out there, I don't know, which are popular. They have collected a lot of information. I can think of Optum, Baby for You or Baby for Us. One is that other one. These have, IQVIA is another one. So these are vendors who have collected or integrated a lot of their clinical trials as well as other EMR data sets. And they do come up with creative ideas to mine their data and the way we want to look at it. So we can find some patient cohorts, especially if you're looking from a disease state and mom, mom with diabetes, mom with schizophrenia, then those large databases can get you a subset of these patient cohorts. I totally agree with what was said here, that these are more clinical focused. Sometimes the ICD codes are all over the place. And sometimes, from a PK/PD perspective, only if the protocol or the center has collected it for some other reasons, you would have those exposure data. Otherwise, it's always after the fact, right? The mom was exposed to a drug and then it's gone. It's so true in oncology, because oncology is not a daily dosing thing. So if a patient comes in today and says, oh, I think I'm pregnant, that you can draw a blood sample, because in oncology, the drug may have been given 15 days before, or even 3 months before, and the patient is checking in today. So taking the samples may or may not give you the true picture of what really happened, right? So, but yes, there are some vendors out there for these large database and are. Yeah.
It sounds like not having available tools to be able to find those resources that are already out there and then link them is really sort of a barrier right now that we have for maternal and pediatric therapeutics and linking those two. So what kind of tools do you think would be useful to be able to leverage already existing data and data that's currently being created today so that we can have a better understanding or better linkage of maternal and pediatric therapeutics? Such as databases or other tools to harmonize data. Do you have any examples of what you as a researcher would really like to see to make this data more accessible?
Well, I think, Katie, sort of a central place to find the information is the first step. And again, I think Imprint is perfectly positioned to do that. That's probably just as important as sort of collecting all the PK data, as part of that resource. And then, I think DASH is probably a good example of, as Tamara was talking about, of sort of what kind of information one would want that probably is not going to be available for all networks or all databases, but at least having sort of a central repository where someone can see what are the pediatric and maternal databases and repositories, et cetera, that exist.
Anyone else? Either one of our panelists or somebody from the audience today? What tools are you looking for? What resources would help identify the data?
So it didn't get funded, but I put in me and a group of collaborators put in a grant to the FDA to create a database of databases for neonatal, any kind of aggregated neonatal data. Because I think, there's a lot of groups in the pharmaceutical industry, in the, other stakeholders in the drug development space that have difficulty designing, for example, neonatal clinical trials, because there's a lack of understanding of typical disease course. What is the control arm going to look like? There's lack of understanding about like pharmacoepidemiology of typical drug exposures. You're scared to do a steroid clinical trial, but half the babies in the NICU are already getting steroids. So like very basic inability for stakeholders to understand what's happening as in clinical care is in the NICU at baseline. So similar to have kind of a database of databases is a place where a stakeholder, an academic, a pharma, a CRO could go and say, I'm interested in this patient population over this time frame, birth to 3 months, and this disease process or this drug exposure. And what are the current databases that contain that? So Vaughan, the examples are Vaughan, CPQCC out in California, NIH, FDA, all these different places have aggregated neonatal data, but there's not a one-stop shop where somebody can go and say, where can I find natural history of this disease? Where can I find frequency of drug exposure in this population? And so obviously when I was thinking about it, I was just thinking about neonates, but something similar that could capture all the, you could categorize them into open source or fee for service. You could categorize them however you wanted, but just a one-stop shop where you could find what are the data sources for pregnant women, for perinatal, for neonatal, so that I think, Manali, you said each person is not reinventing the wheel. Each person is not either delaying study design or, in the case of neonates, just foregoing it. Saying this is not even worth the effort.
True.
So that there's one place where people can go and get a sense of the landscape, so that there is at least a place to begin.
Kind of a library. I think I would like to call it a library. You go in. Yeah.
I mean, those kind of databases exist for other fields. I mean, in the social sciences, there's huge databases, and even the more social science aspects of OB epidemiology, you can access that information. And, I mean, I don't know how they work in terms of access and who's allowed in and, who controls access, but, and what kinds of studies can be done looking at that database. But those are the kind of things that, I mean, I think, especially for people who do, the chart reviews, that kind of analysis, it would be really helpful, I think, for especially, for investigators.
Yeah. I think we spoke about this earlier, but linking of these EMRs, I think, so that when the mom is delivered and then goes to the pediatrician and then, or the NICU, and then what happens to that baby at 1 year age and maybe at 18 years of age, right? Like it's the whole development spectrum. And if all these EMRs could be linked, even, you don't lose that continuity of the story of what happened. These exposures are rare. So we need to take all the opportunity to learn from them.
And one of the things that can do that also, as that's the one step that's lost when you're looking at some of the European databases that have ICD-9 codes and with diagnoses and prescriptions, because what you're missing is that note in the chart that, is she on the drug? Did she take the drug? When did she take the drug? And if you could, and oftentimes you can find that in the clinical database, but it's not in those abstract, impersonal prescription diagnostic codes that really compromises your data, because you can't be sure.
And to add to what you're saying is, I don't think there's a standardization of those codes too. ICD codes are the way, the prescriber wants to code them. There's no standardization. So again, what are you looking for, right? You build a whole ICD code bank for your epidemiologist to go and do the chart review. But if it misses one or two critical ones, then that's the limitation of the study.
So Tamara, you just put something in the comments, and maybe you could follow back up on that, because Leslie Ann also mentioned like linking pharmacy databases. This would all be great, but the barriers to doing that I think are huge. And so you bring up the Stephen Patrick. I'm not aware of his work, but maybe sort of going
So he presented briefly yesterday. He's a neonatologist who's really in the public health space, and his focus is around neonatal opiate withdrawal syndrome and optimizing the care of the mother-infant dyad. So he has, it's like a big center, I think at Vanderbilt, and I think Vanderbilt sponsors this big center, and basically he's starting with that disease process as a proof of principle of how you can go into, I think, state Medicaid databases, private EHRs, all sources of clinical information, and systematically link the maternal and the neonatal records, specifically to investigate now's outcomes. But I'm hoping that if what they do is successful, it'll maybe generalizable to other states or other EHRs, that kind of thing.
Okay, next I'd like to move on to another barrier that we have identified, which is pulling in additional people from our communities to be able to do maternal and pediatric research. So how do we encourage maternal pediatric research at smaller centers where there is not a critical mass of investigators or resources? What resources are needed by these investigators, or would it be better to get them involved in larger networks or projects? So how do we really start capturing these patients, these investigators who are not already being captured by our available networks and who are not already doing this research?
I mean, I think historically people have reached out to other institutions because they either have a population, a subset that we don't have at our own, or we just need more numbers, and it's a way of expanding enrollment. I think one of the critical things, especially when you're dealing with pharmacology, is just a recognition of the need for precision. That biospecimens, if you're not precise, if they're not appropriately labeled, if they're not appropriately stored, can be really problematic. And so I think there's a need, especially there's a need to educate the research coordinators at these additional sites if we're going to expand. But I think historically we've done that. I think the bigger issue is how to get OBs interested in doing the research. It's like, you don't know what you don't know, and we don't know it.
Yeah. I wonder if I could take it from another way to answer this question. Not everybody needs to be a researcher. It's time consuming. It needs a little set of teamwork to really achieve, to be a researcher. But each individual can contribute to research. Even just sending the right, mom who's exposed to the right channel, hey, go here, and then the experts will pick you up and take you on to it. I think that itself could be a huge service that all centers can do across, because these are such few instances. I can't, emphasize more. I was part of a Herceptin registry that ran for so many years, and we had 3 tracheoesophageal fistulae at that time that we were reviewing. So you can just see massive effort put in, but very little return. So I would say, can we do something to just educate maybe the OBGYNs and the pediatricians across the board to say, if you come across something, then report in. Even at this point, if it's reporting into the FDA Sentinel, let's at least get that message out, and hopefully we can create a more, still another location where things can flow in. But I think that everybody can contribute to research in science.
There are also a lot of networks that have kind of a mentorship model. And so the Pediatric Critical Care Network has 12 primary sites and 12 ancillary sites. And each of those ancillaries is sort of a smaller site that's paired with one of the primary sites. And so, doing something like that is, I think, a way to sort of develop your network infrastructure and develop new sites. The Pediatric Trials Network did something similar. We would, we always had sort of well-established sites so we could make sure this study would be successful, but then we'd usually have a couple more junior sites that we could sort of bring along and develop into new sites over time.
And something that would help that break down those barriers is to have the IRBs, are pre-set out to rely on the larger hospital, and to have the legal agreements already in place, the data use agreements, that are already facilitated and standard between some of the more rural or smaller hospitals and the larger centers that might be more experienced.
Okay, and we are almost out of time. So our last question for this subsession is, how can we better leverage our public and private partnerships to facilitate maternal and pediatric therapeutic research?
So, I think there's still a bit of, I'm speaking as an academic who's only been in academic arena. There's still a bit of taboo, I think, around partnering with pharmaceutical industries, just because of, I think, historical context of conflicts of interest and lack of adequate disclosures of conflicts. But I feel pretty strongly that in order to advance drug development and regulatory science in children, a partnership with industry has to be strengthened. For two reasons. Industry has a lot of knowledge and experience in regulatory science that the pediatric community lacks. And the pediatric community has a lot of knowledge about pediatric physiology and clinical care and all those things that that industry lacks. And so right now, a huge barrier to, for example, getting new drugs developed and labeled in the NICU. You heard from Dr. Davis yesterday, we haven't had anything since the early 90s. A huge, and I mean, look at oncology and CF, there's a lot of populations that are not easy to study that get drugs developed and labeled. I think a huge barrier is that kind of taboo. And at least in the pharmacology space, I think we need to really explicitly say, not only is it okay, it's encouraged to build these collaborations and to work together to advance drug development in these orphan populations. There's a lot of public medical bodies that are still quite negative about academic-private collaborations. And so I think, it's a little bit of it is overcoming that stigma and that taboo and really having a celebrated way to build those bridges and foster those collaborations. The FNIH presentation yesterday was really interesting because it seems like they are doing that very well, not necessarily in the pediatric space, but that was a fascinating presentation. It made me think about how something similar could be fostered for obstetric and pediatric research.
Wonderful. Anybody else like to comment to that? Dr. Watts?
I would say that there are examples of this, to what extent they've been really effective. I think it's still we're still working on that, but IACT for Children is a big sort of nonprofit that tries to sort of link industry and academics and to do pediatric clinical trials. I'm not sure if there's anything comparable for the obstetric population. there are efforts to do this. There are just still a lot of barriers to sort of, as Tamara and others have mentioned, to making these effective.
Speaking obstetrically, I think the industry is going to be, as we've frequently heard, going to be quite reluctant to voluntarily do parallel studies in the obstetrical population. Even though, we may not have a specific indication for that drug, it's certainly going to be used by women who are pregnant. And I'm thinking specifically, the discussion that we had yesterday regarding, drugs and vaccines for emerging diseases, i.e. COVID. But if there's some way that, the obstetrical community isn't left out in the lurch, it's almost like we don't know that these drugs are being developed until they've already been developed for the general and tested. And now we're faced with catch-up, with the struggle to try to use these and, test them opportunistically and in very unorganized fashion. If there's some way that the FDA, as it gets NDAs, coming in, where the women's division of the FDA can look at, be aware of these drugs and say, okay, this is a drug that pregnant women are going to be using, and put out an RFP, coordinate in some fashion with existing, interested parties within the obstetrical community, so that we can study these, so we're not a year behind. And if there could be at least some partnership with the drug company in terms of, they already have the assays to be, one of the biggest issues is in terms of doing PK studies, having access to that assay, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel in our own, mass spec departments, or however, whatever the appropriate assay is for that drug. If we could at least, work with industry to have access to their technology, if not their global support, I think that might be a big way to do it. But we have to, in some timely fashion, get these drugs studied in pregnancy.
So I'm encouraged by the new initiative by FDA, which is on the fields of, diversity, inclusion, and, DIB, everybody in. And that guidance is out for review just now to the community. And it's specifically calling out these underrepresented populations, including pregnant women and children, and the age, very elderly are not there. So there's a lot, different races are not represented in clinical trials. That guidance. So I'm encouraged by the FDA's move in this direction. Work needs to be done there, because, it can't be too onerous on the industry, but, too regulated loses the creativity. But it is a very good, I think, step in the right direction.
But unless you mandate it, unless there's money to support it, having a guidance does squat. We've had a PK guidance in pregnancy since 2004, and yet not a single one of these drugs got studied in pregnancy at the same time they were studied in the general population.
Yeah.
Kate, it's not often that pediatrics leads the way in terms of, but the BPCA has been successful, and it's because it's been mandated. There are incentives and there are mandates, but it's a good model, and it seems like at least Preglac and others are starting to push for that, but I don't know how far along it's come.
I don't think from my own personal experience, it hasn't come that far. ACOG is not behind it the same way that your pediatric organizations, have been. I put in a proposal for an ACOG pharmacology conference, probably 5 years ago, and I got turned down. And I asked the person, he says, well, it's boring. Nobody's going to come, so it's like, seriously. That was,
Yeah.
but so I think, that's not to say that I'm not going to make some kind of David Haas and I could go on in this together and make some kind of appeal to ACOG, but I just don't think we have the support from the obstetrical community the way that your pediatric community had. I mean, we talked about this a long time ago. We talked about this in 2000, and 22 years later, we're still in the same boat.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for a really great first sub-session. And unfortunately, we now have to move on to our next session, which is training the next generation of maternal pediatric therapeutics investigators. So again, if anybody in the audience has any questions, please pop them into the Q&A or the chat or raise your hand. But to start the way, our first question about training the next generation is, how do we advocate for the importance of maternal and pediatric pharmacology at various stages of professional training?
So I think Imprint, Erin, I see your comment. I think Imprint has the opportunity to, I don't know if they have interest, but there's the opportunity to interface with some of these big conferences where there's going to be a lot of academic obstetricians, a lot of academic neonatologists, and a lot of academic pediatricians. And I wonder if it wouldn't be worth the time and effort to liaise with the organizing committees. Not an individual researcher like Kate or me, but these, kind of a NIH funded organization like Imprint to liaise with the organizing committees of these big annual meetings and offer to work with AAP members or ACOG members to put together to Sarah's point, clinically relevant, user-friendly pharmacology session at each meeting, so that there's at least something that an interested party could learn in the pharmacology space at these big meetings. It's hard, I think, to rely on individual researchers to make that happen year after year. But if some organizations like Imprint were willing to liaise with the organizing committees, to get something quasi-standing, like a commitment that there would be some representation every year, that would be a huge step in the right direction for interesting people outside of our immediate little circle.
Well, that's a great idea. Does anybody else have any other suggestions about how do we advocate for pharmacology training?
The T32 programs seem to have been very successful, and making sure that they are exposed to the pediatric as well as the neonatal and maternal fields, I think is a great way to get the clinicians interested, even if they don't choose to do research for their career. If they can talk to their colleagues and tell them what clinical pharmacology can do and help them answer their questions, the pain points, that is a success in my book.
I had gone through T32 in clinical pharmacology. I'm in maternal fetal medicine. I took an extra year after my fellowship, and it definitely completely changed my research trajectory. And I agree, advertising it within our community and identifying partners. I think there's a lot of pediatric pharmacology sites and networks. I don't, just in my T32 program, there was a lot more people doing peds pharm. I was the only OB. So, so for where I am, it was a little bit of a desert, but it was a great opportunity. And it certainly, I think the Imprint funding opportunities are great as well. I just found out about it now, but advertising that to MFM programs, so they know that there's these funding opportunities for fellows, perhaps including it on the SMFM site as opportunities for fellows who aren't, at a hub institution, so may not even be aware that this exists, but, could work under a mentor and and do a related study. The SMFM website does have a section for grants, and SMFM as a organization offers its own grants, but I think specifically highlighting these fellow grant opportunities or training grant opportunities, it's great. Like I said, I'm in this field. I did a T32, and I only now did I find out that this was even an opportunity. So,
Dr. Wilson, do you have a hand up?
Yeah, one of the things is when faced with resistance from clinicians, is to go to other groups that have access to your population. So, for example, nursing researchers should be encouraged. Clinical pharmacy, I'm not even sure clinical pharmacy has a obstetrical specialty approved yet. For example, psychologists who take care of many postpartum patients. There is a huge group of scientifically trained professionals who happen not to be what you people have called clinicians. And they are the ones who have driven pediatric clinical pharmacology. I mean, without the clinical pharmacists, pediatric physician clinical pharmacologists, we would never have been successful. We haven't been as good at getting nursing involved, but there are a lot of people, midwives. I mean, there are a huge number of potentially great researchers that need to be recruited. Once they are recruited and get grants, the physicians will follow. Just my impression.
I think that's a wonderful point, is that we do need to branch out and look at our other clinicians and our other nurses and pharmacists beyond our MDs and PhDs to expand our pool of investigators. And we do have some hands up. Dr. Tremblay?
Yeah, one question I have here, and it's not my area of expertise, but I'm wondering if anyone else here does. In terms of ACGME or training, I mean, I personally was not exposed to clinical pharmacology until I became a pediatric infectious disease fellow and started to ask, well, how did you come up with that dosing? And the general answer was, well, we sat around a table and took the adult dosing and divided by 70, and we were kind of close and we hope we're okay, which was an insufficient answer and drove me to do clinical pharmacology. So I wonder if there's a way of integrating this conversation much, much earlier, and not having clinical pharmacology be an appendage to our clinical care, but rather, frankly, the center point of what we do outside of adult medicine, where it should be part of the daily conversation of every drug that you prescribe. So I kind of challenge us to think about this at a larger level, just like Dr. Wilson just mentioned about including a larger like a larger catchment. Frankly, as a T32 PI, I will tell you that it's actually, at least at our institution, really hard to find interested, eligible individuals. We have a fabulous cohort right now, but I worry about it every time. And I almost wish it were more integrated so that there would be a larger pool of trainees. So I don't know if anyone out there lives in that ACGME world, but I think this conversation needs to start a lot earlier than when you get to your fellowship.
Absolutely. We definitely need to broaden our understanding of when to incorporate clinical pharmacology, as well as how to incorporate clinical pharmacology training and experience across the spectrum of training. Dr. Sipka?
Yeah, I know the Pharma Foundation a number of years ago, because I was involved in this, made videos on different subpopulations in terms of specific, PK things about them. I mean, this was over a decade ago, but I certainly, there's limited at each institution, there's limited people, in fact, mostly none, that have any understanding of pharmacology as it relates to that specialty, i.e. OB. And one thing we could do is to develop, a Zoom or tapes, videos of presentations on obstetrical pharmacology or OB pharmacology, and peds pharmacology, I'm sorry, or neonatal pharmacology, and then actually market them to or distribute them to all the different residency programs as an educational packet. But to make people interested in that, you have to go to like the boards, the examining boards, and convince them that it's important to include questions about OB pharmacology, because once those questions are there, then the residency programs have an incentive to teach people.
Great suggestion. Dr. Raman, do you have a hand up?
Yes, thank you. Raman Venkat from University of Pittsburgh. I just wanted to mention about how I got started in pregnancy clinical pharmacology work. I was working in organ transplant and pharmacology, and Steve Coritas happened to have a clinical issue with using ritodrin in patients in the 1980s with increased cardiac toxicity as the infusion rates were being increased in order to get the required number of contractions. We were able to offer a clinical pharmacology solution to that. Based on the pharmacokinetics, we were able to tell what needs to be done in order to see the observed effect without the side effects going up in terms of increased cardiac toxicity. That's how our relationship started. So I think if journals, especially OBGYN journals, devote a section to clinical applications of clinical pharmacology or something to the extent, have case reports like this reported and share the success stories with the OBGYN. If I'm going to read that in every issue that comes to me, I will think, oh, perhaps I need to think about it, check into it. So that's one suggestion.
That's a great suggestion. And Dr. Desai has a really clever tip in the chat. Start with the patient to inspire the clinician. So let them see what's in it for them when they understand there is a lack of data to drive clinical decision making on a lot of our pharmaceuticals and treatments for pregnant, lactating, and pediatric patients. So playing into the what's in it for me aspect of that to drive clinical training and interest in maternal and pediatric therapeutic research, I think is very clever as well. Okay, moving on. How can we encourage maternal and fetal medicine and pediatric fellows to become more involved in maternal and pediatric pharmacology research?
So I think we have to go talk to them. Tell them what clinical pharmacology can do early in the course of their residency.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. If you're located at a children's hospital with a large pediatric residency, I think trying to get onto their half-day didactic schedule as early in residency as possible and trying to make an annual appearance is important. So, the current state of affairs is that I think a lot of divisions of clin pharm around the country have a set of intro type lectures that are meant to be inspiring and maybe share a little bit of ongoing pharmacology research that we present to the pediatric residents to try to get them excited and engaged in thinking about pharmacology more deeply, and then best case scenario, eventually pursuing further training in clinical pharmacology. But I do think I'm coming up with a lot of ideas for imprint. One thing imprint could consider would be maybe not reinventing the wheel, but like NICHD has the clinical pharmacology webinar course, but I think that is kind of high level for the average pediatric trainee or the average obstetric trainee. So maybe creating more of an intro level core set of lectures that could be available for pediatric residency program directors or obstetric residency program directors. That is really a little more basic, but also a few, like the prior speaker mentioned, examples of clinical applicability or ways that this science can improve clinical care. you know, if that was something that could be relatively easily rolled out, I think it would make it more universally used than only the few hospitals across the country that have very strong divisions of Peds Clin Pharm that are doing this work in a targeted way. It's important, I think, to have a resource that can be more universally accessed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the webinar session that NIPHD does have is very, very interesting. But you're right, it is a little high level for learners who are not as familiar with clinical pharmacology. So that is a great suggestion. We have a comment in the chat. Show the learners how much low-hanging fruit for publications and you know, put that into grants as well. There may be for them to do maternal and pediatric therapeutic research.
I mean, that's a
as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Like one thing I tell potential fellows who want to work with me is Clin Pharm is one of the few things you can do as a fellow and change the way we practice medicine. You can do a small PK study in this population and come up with the correct dosing, and that can have a big impact.
Yeah, that brought up a question that I had for you guys as well, is if you do have a minute with a learner, what would you tell them to sort of bring them or to inspire their interest in maternal and pediatric clinical pharmacology?
I think just like Adriana said, you know, ask them how they got the dose for the drugs that they use and help them understand that there's not a lot that this dosing and, you know, is based on, and that for a lot of the drugs, there's a lot of opportunity for refining that and getting that a lot better. So there's lots of opportunities here.
I may add that the dose is not only to get it right for the efficacy, because you definitely want to see it quickly, but the long-term safety. Unless you don't study the long-term studies, you might just give it and get a quick result from, you know, whatever you're trying to treat, but you don't know what will occur, you know, maybe in a year's time or longer. So there's so many unknowns that you can get by just getting the dose right? So. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sticka?
Yeah, speaking of paucity of data, I just was one of the authors. ACOG just put out a clinical practice guideline on management of headache in pregnancy and lactation. And typically these clinical practice guidelines are, you know, the biggest problem is sorting through all the clinical trials and picking which ones were, you know, well-designed and the results are reliable and quality of data. That wasn't our problem. We had one RCT. For all of the migraine medications that are used in pregnancy, there was one RCT. Then it compared IV metoclopramide and diphenhydramine to oral codeine, and that's it. Everything out there's studies outside of pregnancy, but nobody has studied migraines in pregnancy. So it's like, I mean, there's so many different areas where it's just ripe for the study. But there has to be some coordination also. I mean, people within NIH, within, you know, the neurology and OB, I mean, NICHD have to realize these clinical holes and put together our, you know, grant possibilities.
Absolutely. And we do have a comment in the chat about some resources that may be helpful for our trainees. So putting together a library of case-based learning scenarios for trainees to work through could potentially be helpful as well. Okay, we've got one final question for the session before moving on to our final subsession. As many clinical fellowships only have a year or less dedicated to research, how do you prioritize the skills and knowledge needed to be a successful researcher?
I think it's pretty difficult to expect somebody to go through all of the steps for one project in a year. And so having them be involved in multiple projects at different stages where they can see all of the steps that go on. But if your IRB isn't approved before your project, your 1 year, if that's part of the time, then you lose a whole lot of time waiting in that for the IRB to get written and approved and everything. So having different projects at different stages where they can contribute to the data analysis for one project, the IRB writing for another project, and let them see all of the aspects that way from different projects, that could be really helpful in giving them the whole thing, the whole big picture, but still making some progress, analyzing results and getting things done overall.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. I've certainly seen a lot of trainees get sort of in the minefield of IRB approval and in the first 6 months of their project is done. Absolutely. Anybody else have any suggestions about prioritizing skills and knowledge during the research year for training?
I think from a skills perspective, having that continuous open mindset, a learning mindset for the students is important. Sometimes they would do it only because it's a checkbox. I'm supposed to do the fellowships, I'm supposed to do this research, and that's it, right? To have that hypothesis generation mindset, to be open, curious, I think that soft skill will take them a longer way than just completing one project.
I think another thing is just in general fellowship structure. So you are a little bit set up to fail if you have 12 months in a row at the end of your fellowship and nothing else. And instead, if it's broken up where you have 3 to 6 months each year, that lets you go through the process of doing a project beginning to end. And I really don't think you're going to, develop researchers unless it's someone that does do a project from beginning to end, because it's hard to get the exposure is good doing multiple different projects. That's sort of how you get the hook in. But for me, I want my trainees to do a whole project from beginning to end. And I think splitting it up like that gives them time to develop the project idea and their skills as they're going from the beginning to the end of a project.
Great. Thank you for this great conversation about training our next generation of researchers. So for our last sub-session, we're going to talk about how do we move forward. And our first question is, what do you believe is the most important gap in our current knowledge or area of maternal and pediatric research that we need to address?
It's a loaded question. Maybe each one of us will give a slightly different perspective. So for me, I wear my clinician hat in the NICU and then my clinical pharmacology sort of academic hat. And for me, what feels increasingly pressing is I would call it kind of like translation chasm between all of the really great knowledge discovery in the pharmacology space and how very little of it is translating into improvements in clinical care at the bedside. So an example is, there's a lot of sort of neonatal pharmacokinetic models that are developed and validated and suggest alternate dosing paradigms based on new variables besides just traditional weight-based dosing. And almost none of those have led to changes in dosing in the actual NICU. And so for me, that feels increasingly urgent, is to create a structure to translate new and helpful knowledge into changes in clinical practice. I'll stop there.
Dr. Choi, did I see you come off of mute?
Oh, yeah. So I was going to say something based on my experience here. So there are a lot of knowledge gaps. But personally, I would point out one, more understanding on the differences between full-term neonate versus preterm neonate in terms of PK changes. Any factors that would affect on the changes and differences in PK would be great, because I'm working in the field of antiviral product, and for dealing with a product for a disease that have an impact of all ages, including preemies, and that conversation always come up. And then I always realize that in terms of differences between preterm versus full-term neonate, other than some knowledge about renal function, we really do not know a lot. And along with that, some new modalities, and especially therapeutic proteins and biological product and monoclonal antibodies, while they are widely used, we really actually have very limited understanding in its clinical pharmacology characteristic in neonate and including preemies. And for example, you will, if you search PK of monoclonal antibodies, you will just end up looking at one or a couple of papers with one drug approved for RSV infection, and everyone's just relying on that one PK study conducted in neonate with RSV drug for RSV treatment for monoclonal antibodies. So that's the area that I think we have a significant knowledge gap. And moving to pregnant population, based on the conversation that we had, a recent workshop and everything, well, actually surprisingly, we have a very limited understanding in terms of postpartum period. So we all acknowledge that it's very important to understand changes in PK and PD during pregnancy, and we talk about, pregnancy term-dependent change, whether or not it exists, but at the same time, we have paid a little less paid attention to the changes in postpartum and whether or not it's fair to assume that it's similar to pre-pregnancy. So that's another area that that I think we have significant knowledge gap. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Dr. Sticka?
Yeah, just taking off on that, one of the areas, I mean, a lot of the studies that have been done in pregnancy have been limited either to the third trimester when things are maximally changed either up or down, and some in the second trimester, and there's occasional studies in the late first trimester. And most of the comparators have been distant postpartum so that we get a true non-pregnant state. What was really lacking is information about the early first trimester as to when things change, whether when they start being induced or when they start being inhibited. We have absolutely no idea when those processes first begin to take off, as well as we're really limited with rare exceptions. I mean, UGT1A4 is a classic example where we do have information, but we're really missing information in that early postpartum period as to whether they're still functioning as if they're pregnant, or whether these enzymes or these things, when do processes go back to normal? What's the change, in the curve in their early postpartum? Because we need that information to build our models. I mean, we're really good at pregnant, not pregnant, but pregnancy is not a black-white situation either. It's a dynamic process as well as postpartum. And I think we need to fill in those holes.
For me, with the field of pharmacogenetics, I think there is a lack of pediatric and maternal research on how pharmacogenetics should be implemented. The changing body of a pregnant woman, or the postpartum period when antidepressants are likely to be prescribed, how they're implementing pharmacogenetic guided prescribing for a lot of these drugs at some large academic medical centers, and we don't know if those recommendations are really applicable to children, adolescents, pregnant women, postpartum women. And so there's a big lack of data there for me in the pharmacogenetics field that can be filled.
Yeah, from the industry or the research perspective, I think there is a big gap. And even if we wanted to do it, say I want to test this in a pregnant woman, I think we would consult 2 or 3 KOLs, get their opinion and build on it, right? But there are no set patterns in which you want to do the research there, or you want to do, even for pediatrics, we have these pediatric plans and we build it up based on pediatric KOLs, but it's all this one-to-one, right? There's no overarching, this is how we should be doing it, and push it forward. And I think institutes like NIH or ACOG and all can come up with these so that there's this collective knowledge. So when industry does decide or should decide to do it, they have this resources, right? It's not, even the thought of doing it just now could be intimidating. Okay, where do I go? And the IRBs, if they see a protocol, say, okay, where do I go? You know, how do I know this is the right thing? So it's so much, we have a gap in just, I don't want to name it guidance, but it's somewhat that, right? Some recommendations or structure, framework on how to do it.
Well, thank you. Dr. Watt, did I see you come off of mute just a second ago?
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of follow up on what Tamara said, because I think, there obviously are lots of gaps within, obstetric and pediatric pharmacology that we as investigators are seeking to address. But I do wonder, sort of to Tamara's point, like, how do we then take our, complicated PK models and bring them to the bedside? And I think I agree with Tamara. I think that's sort of a big area where we need to do better at trying to get those recommendations into those, to the bedside. The FDA process is important, and we do a lot of, IND, FDA compliant studies, but it's a long process, and we need to figure out efficiencies and ways to get that to the bedside quicker.
So I'm wondering, I don't know if I don't see Sandra on this, but I know that that the Cincinnati group has actually had some significant successes in implementing this. Of course, Laura, you're on it, but significant successes in actually implementing this in the electronic systems in the hospital, at least in Cincinnati Children's. And I don't know enough detail to really speak to it with any authority. So I don't know, maybe Laura or Miyuki. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that's been very successful is getting the clinicians involved and interested, asking them what the pain points are and their how they would like it to be solved. One of the things that we do with each time we implement one of our clinical decision support systems is to ask the users, the end users of it, what it is that they would like to see, what would work best for them in their clinical workflow, and not apply, the principles that we learned from the IBD group to the NICU, or the NICU to the oncologist, and really talk to the end users about what it is that they're looking for and how we could help them get there with the PK model. Sort of under the hood, so they don't really have to think about it. They just understand that, we know what we're doing and can help them. And when they're involved in some of the background research that goes into that before it gets implemented, that really helps. But just to ask them what it is that they want that would be helpful to them, instead of saying, oh, we think you should do AUC guided dosing, or, whatever, like, or you should switch to every 3-week infusions or something like that. Asking them and showing them with their patient population, that we can help them.
Yeah, and regarding the implementation, we also provide clinical consultation service to provide dosing recommendation based on the pharmacokinetic prediction using model-informed dosing approach. And those are the providing service requested by clinical service and clinical team. And I think those are the starting point where we develop decision support tool to the goal of the, so we provide service, but if we have a decision support tool integrated in Epic, clinical team can use the tool by themselves to come up with the prescription dosing at the bedside.
The clinical pharmacists have really been instrumental in helping us do that and providing sort of that bridge between the clinical pharmacology and the doctors, and doing a little bit of that translation for us and helping the doctors understand the PK as well.
Yeah, I think the communication between us and the clinical team is the driving force to move this project forward.
I don't know, Philip had a comment first, maybe?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I was at Cincinnati and actually recruited Sander to come. But the key is actually goes back to what someone was brought up from Sick Children's about how you change practice. And what I think the reason it works in Cincinnati is not just that it's integrated and it works and it's multi-specialty so that you have a lot of people seeing how it works. The key is that the dashboard tells the clinician, this is what we think is going to happen in your patient. And then when they measure the level and they see that the dot falls on the prediction, there's nothing as powerful. It's somewhat useful when you explain to a clinician why something went wrong with his patient. It is logarithmically more powerful when you say, this is what's going to happen, and it happens.
And actually, I just want to add that the integration of the system is done really, really well. I mean, it is important that it works. You know, that to spend the time to develop the software, make sure that it interacts as part of the clinical decision support. And I think the implementation, I mean, there's all these different elements that have to be there, but the implementation is remarkable. And what elevates it is that investment of all the stakeholders.
Yeah, and also you had an unusual situation in Cincinnati Children's where the CEO of the hospital said it is important that, one, we talk to parents and we explain to them why we're doing things to their kids. They have access to their charts, so they look at what's going on and see what's happening. So there's an institutional commitment to quality care that works. So it's not surprising, I think, that it works in Cincinnati and it doesn't work in other places. But it really, and in fact, I think one of the things the imprint needs to do is to have a more extensive presentation of I mean, Sander has a lot of slides on specific cases, but that's the kind of thing you need to do to a clinician is say, look, you know, you have a septic patient of meropenem. This is why the dosing regimen in the package insert is wrong. You know, and let's show you what happens when you give an infusion.
Right. This is some really great responses to our first question. We're going to touch on something that came up in one of our last talks. So, what are your top priorities for drugs or drug classes that should be studied in our pediatric and maternal patient populations?
Is that just to people on the panel, or do you want other people to answer?
Anybody? No.
Well, I'll go back to Cincinnati. When it was started, I must say I didn't think this group would be so receptive. Psychiatry was the driver of the success because psychiatrists knew that they didn't know what they were doing with the drugs they had. And they overwhelmingly, I mean, every psychiatric patient was genotyped and had their data put automatically. I mean, and if there's a single group that really needs to be dealt with, I think it's postpartum psychiatric illness, and psychiatric illness during pregnancy. I mean, it's interesting that the psychiatrists they're the only group that's trained to recognize their own weaknesses.
Yeah, and I looked at the BPCA priority list and didn't see any antidepressants on there. So that's definitely an area that we need to suggest through that link that Dr. Pollack posted earlier.
Yeah, the problem is that the BPCA, because I chair the DMC for that, but it doesn't say psychiatric drugs in pregnant and lactating women. It says psychiatric drugs. No, psychiatric drugs are kind of boring in general, but they're not boring in this population.
Other suggestions from the chat so far have been neurosedatives, antidepressants, management of migraine, headaches, pharmaceuticals, and analgesics as well. Are there any other suggestions either from our panelists or from our audience today? Dr. Watt?
Well, I think one of the other things you need to look at is, I think when we were trying to identify drugs to study in lactating women, the things we asked were, what are the most commonly used drugs in this population? And what are the drugs that we think probably are going to get more into breast milk than others? And what are the drugs for which getting into breast milk might be a big problem and cause harm? And so sort of thinking about what are the priorities in terms of identifying drugs of study. And, unfortunately, one of the things we found out through that process was there were very little data on what are the most commonly used drugs in lactating women. And you could sort of make that argument for a lot of different populations in obstetrics and pediatrics, that we just need some basic data that shouldn't be that hard to collect, but aren't out there right now.
That's a great point. Having data first to make data-driven decisions on what to do the research on, certainly important. Dr. Chambers?
We could also leverage from some of the activities done by other groups. I think Conception is one such big initiative, which they did a lot of work trying to find what are the gaps, what are the drugs commonly used, and things like that. So that, while epidemiology and doing our data ourselves, but we could leverage from things that have been done by other groups. I think teratogenic societies in the Europes each country has them, and they get a lot of questions on what drugs can or cannot use, and those call centers could also feed into this, telling us what are the most common, where the patients are asking, right? Patients are saying, I don't have this information, I'm calling into a call center. Could be another way of identifying what really are the gaps.
So I was going to add to that, Dr. Desai, our counseling service, that's the way we tabulate what people care about, because that's what they're calling about and asking. But as Kevin says, the truth of the matter is, for 80% of drugs, we don't even have adequate safety data in pregnancy, let alone lactation. So there's just this huge paucity of data. But I see in the chat, I mean, it's certainly for prescription medications, it's easy enough to go to large claims data and look at the prevalence of use. That doesn't mean that's exactly what you should study, because there are drugs that don't get used because there are no data. So how you set the priority might have different avenues depending on, it might be like in Conception. I see Miriam commented here, where they have these public-private partnerships. Some of the topic areas are chosen, like migraine, where there's a gap and there's an interest and it's a common disorder that needs treatment. But others might be that it's we just don't have enough data from one resource to look at a particular drug or class of drugs. And so we need to pull together data from multiple sources to be able to get at that issue, even though it might be not so commonly used. And that's fair, I think, too.
Our next question is, how do we better leverage real-world data to support pediatric and maternal pharmacology research?
I was going to ask Sarah Vandries a question, and so this opens up that opportunity. So Sarah, I think you shared that at Vanderbilt, you guys have created a system where in a large database, you can identify the pregnancy interval so that you can begin to ask research questions during that pregnancy interval. Will you share a little bit more about how you're doing that in your real world data set?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? So there's a couple things that we're working on, and I think IU and UCSD are similarly working on various things to try to solve this problem. For our electronic health records data, it's a little bit easier because we can throw sort of the natural language processing and AI sort of approaches at it. But basically what we've done is we've figured out, for a mom, when does delivery happen? And then we can pull out things like estimated gestational ages and do, sort of relatively simple mathematics to backdate and figure out when, estimated conception is. That's not going to be perfect. Those of us who work clinically know that it's not perfect in real life either, right? Like you hope you could get it close for the baby and the mom, but we're defining pregnancy windows that way. For another project where we're using more administrative databases that don't have that, sort of note text and whatnot, then we're using sort of throwing a different set of approaches at it, looking at codes, looking at what defines whether this baby was term or preterm, and if we can get close to when the pregnancy started that way. One of the fun wrinkles to this is, it's one of those things where you look at an individual instance and you say, oh, well, this is relatively easy. You've got some data, you've got a mom, you've got a baby, you can match them and whatnot. But when you have just a giant pile of data of a whole bunch of moms, then another pile of data with a whole bunch of babies, and it's not one-to-one, one mom might have 4 kids, you got to get the right pregnancy. Otherwise, we sort of threw this massive approach on it and broke a bunch of servers because there were, allegedly millions and billions of pairs and these gestations that were, 5,000 days. And we're like, oh, that's not right. So, we're sorting that out as we go, and we're committed to making all those approaches publicly available as we solve them. But I think there's not going to be like one solution that works for everything. There's going to be something that works, with electronic health records, then that'll need to be validated at other centers, even if another center is using Epic like we do, the coding practices and then the note generation practices may be different. So it'll have to be validated and potentially tweaked, which gets that whole generalizability thing. We want everybody to do things the same way, but you got to do it in a way that works. And then there'll be a different set of solutions for administrative data that, again, hopefully can be optimized to be used across different sites. And so I don't know if one of the other centers wants to talk about this as well, but again, I think there's many of us working on this, and we're hoping to cross-validate and get this right moving forward. You're right, Epic can define the pregnancy, dating, and gestational age. We have about 5 years of Epic data, and then we have a decade of not Epic data. And also it depends on how you set up your Epic at your site, because one Epic is one Epic, unfortunately. So, it is how it is. So we had that discrete gestational age data for about 2/3 of our cohort, but for another third, it just wasn't there. And so we could either suffer a third or we could come up with another solution. So that's what we're working on, is that other solution.
Wonderful. Does anybody else have any other comments? Any of our panelists or, oh, got a hand up.
I think these are important questions. And in terms of the real world data, actually I just had a chat with folks in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology at Food and Drug Administration, and they're looking at what formal ways can we use to understand, even though we're going to have increased noise or increased uncertainty, what are the strategies for being able to maximize the utility of this and really sort of codify the types of inferences we can make. So there may even be maybe some funding opportunities through some of the FDA mechanisms coming up to keep an eye on for this. We weren't speaking specifically about pediatrics. We were speaking more about other underrepresented populations in terms of being able to capture, excuse me, capture the information and leverage it. And I think the issue being is, you'll never be able to do all the formal studies that have the detailed measurements that we'd like to do ultimately. So what are the operating characteristics of